In 2013, a tragic crime fueled by a sadistic love affair occurred in Jilin, where the older sister fell in love with her brother-in-law, and her husband got together with her sister, turning the two brothers-in-law into romantic rivals. The two men fought over love, leading to a loss of life. More shockingly, after learning of her husband's murder, the older sister covered up the truth in order to carry on an affair with her brother-in-law. On the morning of August 31, 2013, at 7 a.m. in Tuanje Township, Tongyu County, Jilin Province, Old Man Zhang, as usual, led his sheep to the fields to graze. However, from a distance, he spotted a van that had been burned beyond recognition parked by the roadside. Surprised by the presence of such a vehicle in such a remote area, driven by curiosity, Old Man Zhang approached the van to investigate. As he examined it, he discovered a charred body curled up in the passenger seat. Horrified by the scene, he stumbled and ran to the village head's house, trembling as he recounted everything he had witnessed. The village head immediately called the police. Upon receiving the report, the police quickly arrived at the scene. An initial inspection indicated that the van showed no signs of collision, thus ruling out a traffic accident as the cause of the fire. Further examination by the police determined that the position of the body in the passenger seat also ruled out a natural cause of the fire, as the person sitting there could have easily escaped from the vehicle had there been no impact. With these possibilities excluded, the only remaining scenario was that the vehicle fire was deliberately set. The police conducted a more detailed examination of the van and found that the fuel tank cap was open, and a lighter was discovered not far from the vehicle. Based on these clues, the police preliminarily concluded that this was not an accident, but a premeditated murder. However, due to the intense fire, many items inside the vehicle were burned to ashes, leaving very few clues at the scene. Therefore, the police decided to perform an autopsy on the charred body to make any further conclusions. According to the forensic report, the victim was a male whose left occipital bone had a fracture, likely caused by a blow from an object. Furthermore, no dust was found in the victim's respiratory tract, suggesting that the victim was dead before the fire was set. Based on the clues from the report, the police were even more certain that this car-burning case was a homicide. However, as the police were preparing to investigate the identity of the deceased, a woman, sobbing, came to the police station. She told the police that the deceased might be her husband, Zhou Sanwei. After further inquiry, the police learned that this woman, named Li Ying, said her husband also owned such a van, and he had gone out the previous night and had not returned. She had heard from a neighbor that a van identical to theirs had been burned, and it contained a body, which prompted her to come forward. However, because the body had been burned to carbon, it was impossible for Li Ying to identify whether it was indeed her husband. The police then immediately conducted a DNA comparison on the body, and the results confirmed that the victim was Li Ying's husband, Zhou Sanwei. Upon receiving this news, Li Ying was extremely distressed and unable to cooperate with the police investigation for some time. Therefore, the police turned to interviewing Zhou Sanwei's family and neighbors. They learned that Zhou Sanwei was very well regarded, although somewhat introverted. He did not have conflicts with anyone and merely worked quietly every day. The brutal way Zhou Sanwei died shocked the police. Before the incident, Zhou Sanwei had experienced something significant. He had told his wife Li Ying that he was going out to deliver goods late at night and asked her to lock the door and take care of the house. Li Ying, half asleep at the time, simply acknowledged without asking further questions, as it was common for Zhou Sanwei to help people transport goods, even late at night. After Zhou Sanwei drove off, Li Ying continued to sleep. Unaware of where Zhou Sanwei was going or whom he was transporting goods for. The next morning, Li Ying discovered that Zhou Sanwei had not returned home, so she made several calls to him, but his phone was turned off. This raised her suspicions. Meanwhile, the police learned from their investigation that 2 livestock dealers had passed the scene around 2 a.m. on August 31st. At that time, they noticed that the vehicle was already on fire, but through the firelight, they did not see anyone inside. Because they were in a hurry to get to the early market, they did not stay at the scene for long. Based on their statements and the scene investigation, the police inferred that the likely time of Zhou Sanwei's murder was between midnight and 2:30 a.m. on August 31st. Thus, the person who had rented his vehicle to transport goods during this period became the prime suspect. To quickly determine Zhou Sanwei's whereabouts on the day of the incident, the police immediately arranged for a large number of personnel to conduct an extensive investigation centered around the area where the body was dumped. The investigation quickly yielded results. On the day of the incident, Zhou Sanwei was transporting goods in the van, along with his brother-in-law, Zhang Shixin. The police deduced that Zhang Shixin was a major suspect, since he was with Zhou Sanwei in the van during the time of the incident, but was not found in the van after Zhou Sanwei was burned to death. Consequently, the police immediately located Zhang Shixin to find out what had happened that night. However, unexpectedly, upon arriving at the police station, Zhang Shixin immediately confessed to killing Zhou Sanwei. According to Zhang Shixin, on August 30th, he asked Zhou Sanwei to help transport goods to the county town in the early hours of August 31st. Zhou Sanwei picked him up and he sat in the passenger seat and fell asleep. However, Zhang Shixin was woken up by the rough ride and started complaining to Zhou Sanwei about driving too fast, which woke him up. What he didn't expect was that his usually honest and never temperamental brother-in-law would argue back, which embarrassed him. At the same time, Zhang Shixin remembered that he had once found ambiguous and explicit chat records between Zhou Sanwei and his wife, Li Tingting, on her phone. So he confronted Zhou Sanwei about why he was always messaging his wife. Zhou Sanwei retorted, "Aren't you also messaging my wife?" This statement was like a spark that ignited the fury in Zhang Shixin. In fact, Zhang Shixin had long noticed that his wife, Li Tingting, and his brother-in-law Zhou Sanwei were not just casually messaging each other, but were exchanging a large number of ambiguous messages, which had already upset him. As the argument between Zhang Shixin and Zhou Sanwei escalated, it turned into a physical fight in the van. Zhang Shixin, being physically weaker, gradually began to lose the fight. Seeing that he couldn't overpower Zhou Sanwei, Zhang Shixin got out of the van, picked up a rock, and in a fit of rage, struck Zhou Sanwei on the back of the head several times. After the blows, Zhou Sanwei gradually stopped struggling. Exhausted from the fight, Zhang Shixin collapsed on the ground. As he regained some sense, he was horrified to discover that Zhou Sanwei was motionless. Fearing the consequences, Zhang Shixin decided to use a fire to cover up his crime. He placed Zhou Sanwei in the passenger seat, took out a lighter from his pocket, opened the front hood, set the vehicle on fire, and quickly fled the scene. The crime suspect was caught, and the facts of the crime were confessed. The police thought the case would end there, but they discovered a peculiar detail. At the beginning of the argument, Zhou Sanwei had mentioned that Zhang Shixin had also been messaging Zhou Sanwei's wife, Li Ying. This indicated that Zhang Shixin's motive for the crime was not as simple as he had claimed. Therefore, the police speculated that Zhang Shixin might have had an undisclosed relationship with Li Ying, but this relationship was discovered by her husband, Zhou Sanwei. Zhang Shixin, out of fear, decided to kill to silence Zhou Sanwei, not just acting impulsively as he described. Thus, the police decided to retain Zhang Shixin's confession and further investigate the relationship among the four individuals. After further investigation, the police were shocked by the complexity of the relationships among the in-laws. The interactions between the sisters were akin to playing a face-swap game. After obtaining Zhang Shixin's confession, the police decided to search Li Ying's house to investigate her relationship with Zhang Shixin. After searching, the police found a note in Li Ying's house, written by Zhang Shixin to Li Ying. On the note, Zhang Shixin wrote, "I miss you so much. I don't care what happens at home. If the police find you, don't say anything." With the discovery of this note, the police confirmed that the relationship between Li Ying and her brother-in-law, Zhang Shixin, was not simple and had even developed into an extramarital affair. To clarify the true nature of Li Ying and Zhang Shixin's relationship, the police contacted Zhou Sanwei's parents. According to Zhou Sanwei's parents, the relationship between their son Zhou Sanwei and his daughter-in-law Li Ying was not harmonious, and they had even reached the point of discussing divorce shortly before the incident. Zhou Sanwei had told his parents that his wife Li Ying was seeing someone else, but he had not caught her red-handed. He wanted to find concrete evidence of Li Ying's infidelity before divorcing, as it would affect the division of marital assets. Thus, Zhou Sanwei had been dragging his feet on agreeing to the divorce. After learning this clue from Zhou Sanwei's parents, the police began investigating evidence of Li Ying's marital infidelity. They first retrieved Li Ying's phone records, but found nothing unusual. However, the police discovered that Li Ying often refilled payments onto her phone at a small shop not far from where she lived. The police then went to this small shop to continue their investigation. From the payment receipts at the small shop, the police found that Li Ying had refilled payments onto 2 phone numbers, one of which, ending in 7120, was also used by Li Ying, but she had initially hidden this number from the police. More strangely, Li Ying had used this mobile phone number for calls with an unknown number at 2 a.m., 3 a.m., 4 a.m., and 7 a.m. on the day of the incident, which contradicted her claim that she had been sleeping all night. Therefore, the police decided to summon Li Ying to the Public Security Bureau for interrogation. Through the interrogation, Li Ying finally confessed that the unknown number she had been talking to that night belonged to Zhang Shixin. After killing Zhou Sanwei, Zhang Shixin called Li Ying and instructed her to throw away the SIM card with the number ending in 7120. The police then retrieved the SMS chat records between the two through the number ending in 7120. The content of the chat was completely flirty, completely resembling the demeanor of a sweet couple. At this point, seeing that she could no longer hide the truth, Li Ying had no choice but to confess everything to the police. Li Ying told the police that she began a relationship with Zhang Shixin in 2012. Zhang Shixin treated her very well, and it was only with him that she truly experienced what happiness felt like. She cherished her relationship with Zhang Shixin deeply. As for her own husband, Zhou Sanwei, she was constantly dissatisfied with him. Their marriage had been arranged by their parents. Although Zhou Sanwei was honest and decent, he was too dull, and their married life lacked romance. Li Ying was never happy, and she felt indifferent towards Zhou Sanwei's family, often having conflicts with her in-laws. Zhou Sanwei never mediated these conflicts. In contrast, her brother-in-law Zhang Shixin was different. Not only was he handsome and smart, he also understood how to make money and was romantic. Gradually, Li Ying was irresistibly drawn to Zhang Shixin, increasingly dissatisfied with Zhou Sanwei. Li Ying even began to think that she could only be happy with Zhang Shixin, especially since Zhang Shixin's house was just separated from Zhou Sanwei's by a fence, allowing the families to interact very closely, which conveniently provided opportunities for Li Ying to connect with Zhang Shiqin. However, Zhou Sanwei eventually discovered Li Ying and Zhang Shiqin's secret relationship. Though outwardly silent, Zhou Sanwei was accumulating immense anger inside and even started retaliating by flirting with Li Tingting. Over time, Zhou Sanwei and Li Tingting became very close. However, such days were bound to end in disaster. On August 30th, 2013, Zhou Sanwei first hit Li Ying, and then Li Ying texted Zhang Shiqin to complain. The two exchanged continuous messages that day, all of which were seen by Zhou Sanwei. That night, when Zhang Shiqin called Zhou Sanwei out, Zhou Sanwei's bottled-up dissatisfaction exploded, leading to an argument between the two at the slightest provocation. Zhou Sanwei never expected Zhang Shiqin to attack him fatally. Ironically, in her later testimony, Li Ying denied that Zhou Sanwei had hit her, telling the police that she was just joking with Zhang Shiqin to see if he really cared about her. This absurd and immoral love affair ultimately led to a tragedy. With Li Ying's confession, the Van Arsen case was conclusively closed. Eventually, Zhang Shiqin was sentenced to life imprisonment for murder, and Li Ying was also sentenced to life imprisonment for complicity. This case, involving an unrestrained affair between a sister and her brother-in-law and retaliatory flirtation by her husband with her sister, certainly shocks everyone. This tragedy also serves as a constant reminder that while the people around us may not be the best, this is not an excuse for infidelity. If a marriage is unsatisfactory, divorce is a legal way. Trampling on moral values for absurd emotions ultimately brings bad consequences, not so-called happiness. What are your thoughts on this case? Feel free to interact and discuss in the comments section. If you like our content, remember to like and subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell to receive updates immediately. Thank you for watching this episode of Super Detective, exploring bizarre cases and tasting the flavors of life. See you next time.